So, with no further ado, I will ask Leander to share with us some work that he's been doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion justice JEDI, as it's often referred to. And I'll put in a couple times, just as people might join us later, a couple of links to some other work that Leander's been, his website, and then the report that he did for the what was the name of the group? But it was for that Conservation Measures Partnership Learning Initiative, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I'll put in a link to that report and to his podcast and his website in case you want more information from Leander. But I first met Leander, can't even say exactly how many years ago it was, but when he was a graduate student at Colorado State University, I taught him an introduction to the open standards. And really thrilled when he came to work for TNC, and then got to work with him quite a bit there, and really excited to have him share with us what he's been doing lately. So take it away, Leander.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terri. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. So my name is Leander Lacy. For those of you that don't already know me, I am an environmental social scientist. So I do focus groups interviews with on the people side of conservation. I've been doing that for 15 years now. Have a background in wildlife conservation and also in human dimensions of natural resources. Today we're going to be talking about the conservation standards and incorporating JEDI into the conservation standards, and the approach I took in regards to a project I did with the Conservation Measures Partnership. And so the first part of this presentation will just be a presentation I've given before. It'll look like something you've seen before. I know Judy is on the call today. Judy has already seen this presentation before. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how that process was adopted by Bat Conservation International and what we've done in that space. And then I'll leave some space for questions as well at the end. So let me get into the presentation here.
And would folks please mute your selves just as we get started, just to make sure it's not distracting. Thank you.
Thanks, Terri. So this is the process that we did and the project I did for the Conservation Measures Partnership, where we looked at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as it relates to conservation planning. And then we converted that information into how do we incorporate JEDI, or at least considerations for incorporating JEDI into the conservation standards. As I mentioned before, I worked with an amazing team at FOS, Ashley, Adrienne, and Judy. And we had the opportunity to really talk through what does it look like and how might we take the appropriate approach to truly engage on this topic of JEDI and conservation planning. So initially what I did is I did some program reviews. I reviewed 9 different program summaries just of what was already out there and available online about incorporation of JEDI into conservation planning. And from those resources, I pulled together an interview guide to really help us think through how can we truly tackle or approach this topic. And so the first thing that we did is we created qualifying characteristics, and these qualifying characteristics helped me determine who we wanted to interview. And so I believe I have them here. Give me one second. If I do, they're probably in the interview guide that we had put together. And here we go. There's the questionnaire, and maybe not. So I remember from what I do remember of the qualifying characteristics, what we were asking for is, you must have already in some way incorporated JEDI into conservation planning, and you have a documented approach to doing so. You work directly with communities of differences, and you have, again, in some way documented your approach in doing this, and your willingness to share those documents with us. And so those were some of the key qualifying characteristics for who we were trying to engage with around the interviews for this process. And so we interviewed environmental organizations around the world that fit these qualifying characteristics. I can get you the rest of them. I just don't have them off the top of my head right now. And so through that process, we ended up interviewing 12 organizations around the world that were committed to or had in some way engaged around JEDI in conservation planning. They did not have to be applying conservation standards, because we would then translate whatever it is that they were doing into the different steps of the conservation standards. And then we created a summary of the considerations, and we focused a lot on project design implementation. How do you actually do this work? And we organized the report, which Terri has put into the chat box, by the various steps of the conservation standards, and of course a few themes that kind of popped up that may have been separate from the conservation standards, but would be very useful for practitioners as they consider incorporating JEDI. So, 1 second, let me get back to that. There we go. Sorry, my computer wants to be weird and not do this correctly. Let me just go back one more time. Come on, slide. I'm going to assume that you all are still on the actual. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Couldn't find it. All right. So first thing we'll start with is talking about the assess step. And so I think it's also important that I go ahead and bring it up now that the first 2 steps of the conservation standards is where most of the organizations have spent the majority of their time in regards to implementing JEDI. In regards to the last few steps, there was much fewer information to give out because most folks hadn't actually gotten to implementation of JEDI in their conservation planning, or they hadn't gotten to the analyze, adapt, or share phase. And so there will be a lot more information in the beginning steps than there will be in the future steps. So for considerations for the assess step, one of the things that came up a lot with the people that we interviewed is that leadership plays a key role in whether or not JEDI will be incorporated into conservation planning. And so what they mean by that is that if the leadership team is not on board, there will be some individuals who would be more than willing to engage around JEDI, but the successes and failures will be sporadic, and there will be no succinct approach for how they're approaching JEDI, because what we've seen from individuals is that there's some practitioners who are just dedicated to JEDI and know it's important and are willing to work on it despite leadership not being engaged. And because of that, there are, I guess you could call it, spotty success stories with JEDI and conservation planning, because it isn't part of the core foundation of how they do work around conservation. A lot of some of the other considerations would be consider hiring contractors that have the expertise in working on JEDI topics. And so this may be a matter of just bringing in outside consultants, because for the most part, most people in conservation aren't hired because of their JEDI skills, right? And so it's kind of unfair to expect that practitioners will just have this expertise automatically. And so what we've seen is that there are a lot of contractors who have worked in the conservation field who are either BIPOC themselves, or they are of various identities, and they've committed themselves to working with conservation organizations on JEDI topics. And so there could be a need for, in the assess phase, where you're trying to really look at the whole landscape, both bring in that type of expertise, but also other expertise that may be more useful in engaging around social topics and finding out what is the landscape, what is the social landscape. And so that may require hiring contractors. Consider partnering with a human rights or development organization. So once again, as the conservation standards kind of already promotes anyways, partnering is a great way to really begin to assess what is happening in a particular location, neighborhood, state, country. And so consider what partners you want to work with, and human rights or development organizations could be a great partner for you to help understand the lens of social issues happening on your landscape. Consider accountability partners is another one for the assess phase. As you're starting this process, there may be local partners who can keep you accountable. So basically, this is about transparency and trust and vulnerability. Working with another partner for organization in the local area and letting them know that you are focused on these JEDI topics, walking them through the process and helping them to understand that this is an important topic will ensure that they can keep you accountable and check in with you maybe quarterly, whatever the case may be, to really push the work forward. And then on this slide here, hire local to have a team reflective of the local population. This has actually been something that's really simple to do, and a lot of organizations already do anyways, but having local community members be a part of your team, even on a temporary basis, will increase the ability for you to engage with them effectively. And so we've seen this where organizations hire locally, bring them onto the project team, have them help out with assessing the landscape, and even throughout the various pieces of the project, tend to have more trust and more engagement and better engagement with the local communities because they have someone who's local and can have affinity with what's happening. And as it relates to Jedi, it's going to be important that, if possible, to seek out those communities that are underserved in the particular community where you're going to, and seeing if you can hire from those communities. Because as you're developing and understanding the landscape, it's going to be important to have kind of expertise from the actual communities where underprivileged or underserved communities come from. So instead of just hiring locally and like, okay, we just need to hire locally to check off a box. Now we're hiring locally and we want to make sure we have the best understanding possible of the social landscape. Let's go with the most underserved or underprivileged groups and try to bring them onto the project team if possible, so that we can have a better diversity of perspectives. And then for the assess phase, still here, we talked about clarifying your scope. And what that means actually is that what we've learned, or what they've seen, is that if they don't clarify their scope in the beginning, and we'll talk about this again a little bit later, what will happen is neighboring communities will want you to assist them in some sort of way. And what they've found is that they've been stretched thin on their ability to engage with multiple communities. And so making sure that you understand your social and geographic scope, so that you can be able to say, unfortunately, our grant funding doesn't extend into the ability to work with you right now. Maybe we can expand our scope or our funding for phase 2. But having that conversation and knowing the scope now early will allow you to have an effective conversation with them. But that was the concern here about clarifying your scope of work, is that some conservation organizations found themselves being asked by neighboring communities for assistance because they liked what they were seeing, and they also wanted the same thing happening in their community, but unfortunately, it was outside of the scope. Make sure to connect your Jedi work to local concerns or needs. And so all that really means here is make sure that you understand that there is no blanket approach. What in one area may be a women's rights issue, in another area may not be a women's rights issue, right? It may be about the youth, or it may be about poverty, or it may be about mental health. It could be about gang violence, right? And as you assess and understand your conservation needs, try to find out what is that linkage between that conservation need and that social need. If they're completely in two different worlds, it may not be critical that you focus on that social need. So I think it's important to make sure that you're not just focusing on social issues just to focus on social issues, and what is the intention behind it. And so one theme that came out overall is that working on Jedi issues means getting more people to the table. And by working on these Jedi issues and working on these social issues, you're actually involving more voices in the solution for conservation and the sustainability of your project. Because ultimately, the concern here is that there are individuals and community members who can't engage you because they're dealing with systemic oppression issues, or they're dealing with trying to get food on the table, or they're dealing with mental health issues. Removing these barriers and addressing Jedi issues is about getting more voices in the room. Of course, connect directly with the marginalized communities and ask them how they want to be engaged during the process. What we've talked about a lot is bring in stakeholders as soon as possible, right? It's a great way to ensure that you're being equitable and that you're allowing them opportunity to engage in the process. However, it is also possible that these communities don't want to be a part of your assessment phase. Maybe there's like, just do your assessment, we'll give you feedback on the assessment, but we'll be happy to help you when you get to your implementation phase. Or we don't want to be a part of your planning phase, we'll help you assess, and then you guys can go plan, or you all can go plan and then come back to us later when you get to implementation. It could be a variety of different ways that they want to engage with you. So asking them directly is the best way to do this. Next, they talked about trust building a lot in the assess phase. Obviously, this is the beginning stages. You're just starting to build relationships, but I think it's important for us to remember that engagement is different than trust building, and trust building takes time and energy and intentional strategies. And so these conservation groups that I interviewed said that, we wish we had factored in more time for trust building with our funders, because that really did take up more time than we expected. And it's a critical piece. And once we did gain that trust, our work was able to move forward so much faster. And so I know that I've brought in a lot of research on the topic of trust. I've been working on it for the last 8 or 9 years. I do workshops on how to build and sustain trust with diverse communities. And it's good to see that that is a core factor, because even the science shows that of the social factors that contribute to conservation success, trust and engagement are the top 2. And so it's important that we're being intentional about how we build and sustain trust with communities. And then consider a diversity of identities when looking in the assess phase. We're going to get to this a little bit later, but conservation groups have actually been very limited or limiting of themselves of which identity groups they actually engage with. And so I'll tell you about the pattern of what we're starting to see in regards to which diverse identity groups tend to be engaged with. Oops. And then lastly, on the assess phase, make sure that the assess phase is not just about mining sensitive data. Conservation groups who are focused on this, or at least the individuals who are focused on this, are very cautious about making sure that they're not just taking information. By asking these very sensitive questions, you're actually dredging up mental trauma from these individuals, just so that as conservation groups, we can better assess the landscape. So for us, it may be we're just trying to get a better picture, but for them, it's like, oh, you're bringing up these old histories again, you're opening up old trauma again, and I'm not going to get anything from this. My community is not going to be any better. My underserved community group is still going to be underserved after you leave. And so sometimes it's about, oh yeah, we'll give you credibility. We're going to elevate your voice and your platform. And maybe we are going to pay you for even helping us with the assess phase. We want to provide you a stipend just for even talking with us, because we know this is a sensitive topic, and we're not here just to take information from you and not give anything back. And then structure project governance to ensure marginalized groups are part of the decision-making process. Again, talking to them very directly and asking them if they want to be a part of the decision-making process is very important, but thinking about what is your governance structure, who gets to make the decisions in your conservation project, and how do you ensure that marginalized groups are part of that decision-making process. So those are some of the key considerations for the assess phase. I'm just going to get through this, and feel free to write down questions and ask me at the end. Then for the plan phase, so again, you got to consider stakeholder engagement again in this phase. This is going to be a recurring theme. Stakeholder engagement is a key part of JEDI, of considering JEDI in each of the 5 steps of the conservation standards. And so we kind of just want to reiterate that point, that stakeholder engagement is going to happen over and over and over again throughout the entire conservation standards process. It's important to go ahead and think about, in the assess phase, you started to kind of maybe prioritize which marginalized groups you want to work with, or how you want to work with them potentially. And here it's important to start thinking about, what is the communication plan for your various stakeholders? Some groups are going to want to be notified by email, some by phone only, some by flyers, some by the WhatsApp communication. There's various ways, or even maybe they need a Facebook group created here. This is a good time to think about your communication plans and how you're going to be inclusive with the individuals that you're trying to engage with. Next, consider how you're going to take input from marginalized communities. Again, this really comes down to the governance structure, as well as how do you ensure that if there is conflict, how will you address that conflict? How will you ensure that when marginalized communities have something to say, that they're not feeling as though they're being dismissed by whatever it is that you're doing? Again, if you're going to make the commitment to begin with to even engage on this topic, it'll be important for you to ensure that you are creating a two-way communication process, and what are the best ways that they want to have their input taken, and how do you show empathy and show that you are kind of taking what they're saying into consideration. And then lastly on here is set realistic social goals. So this is important. Again, it goes right back to what we said earlier, which is that we don't want to set social goals that are so high, right? Like, oh, we're going to end poverty. No, we're not going to end poverty. Or we're going to, combat racism. Well, maybe a little bit, but we're not going to actually address it fully through a conservation project to like protect the bats. That's not what's going to happen here. Well, what you can do is understand that, okay, through our process, we're going to make sure that we're elevating voices, that we are providing opportunities for people to be educated about this process. So maybe we're providing educational opportunities for particular groups. Maybe we are providing green jobs for particular groups. Those are more realistic than kind of a more higher blanket, like we're going to empower women. That's too big. Be as specific as possible when you're setting your social goals. For the implement phase, this is really important. Again, we talk about stakeholder engagement. Individuals have the right to reject your project. And so, as you all know, the conservation standard is not meant to just be a step-by-step process. Like you start at step one and you go all the way to the end. Some people are going to jump in at different points. And so if they're jumping in right at the implement phase and they hadn't really done some of the steps prior on the assess and planning, they may not have that relationship built up. And so we just want to remind folks here that it's okay for groups of people to say, we don't want your project here. What does that mean? Because now you have funding and you're supposed to do a project here. All that means here is that you have a discussion and you really talk about it and you say, well, why don't you want the project here? What problems do you have with it? If we can't do the project here, where can we pivot to do another project that's similar, that has the same outcomes, that will be able to prove to the communities that you're working with that, hey, this is a great project, this is worth doing, even though these individuals may not be ready right now. So I think this is more about a readiness question. Is there another project area where you can have the same impact and get this community that may reject your project ready in the future to adopt your project based on successes you may have upstream or whatever the case may be? Ensuring that there is free, prior, and informed consent. There are a lot of forms out there online. I think most of you probably already know about this anyways, but just in case, if you just type in free, prior, and informed consent, there are a lot of documents out there to help you make sure that you obtain this information and that it's not something that they feel is being forced on them, or that they are, I guess, giving without any consent at all. And so this is important information to look up. And so if you type in free, prior, informed consent, you'll find plenty of information out there. This also might be a good time to create a memorandum of understanding with marginalized communities to address conflict. In the implementation phase, you get into the throes of the project and a conflict comes up. Having a memorandum of understanding is better than just saying we will address conflict as it comes up. This is saying that we have a system for how conflict is addressed, and we want you to know that we will follow this system if a conflict comes up as we're working with you. And this just kind of gives, again, folks a better sense of security and trust with you, because they know that there's a system in place that they can trust, that they can utilize if conflict comes up. And then empower local communities to ensure sustainability. What is meant by this is that the interviewees were saying that although while it's great to have these projects, it's great that we actually are working with these communities, one of the main outcomes of doing Jedi work is making sure that our conservation projects are relevant and that it's sustainable into the future. And so we've at least heard of conservation projects that are in place, done. We thought it was going to be in perpetuity. And then, 10, 15, 20 years later, there's like a pipeline going through that same land. And we're like, well, what happened here? Like, well, we actually didn't bring enough people along for the ride, as one might say, and be engaged fully in the process. And so if the community is not passing down stories of the importance of that conservation area, there's a more higher likelihood that at some point in the future, they'll forget the importance. And all you need is the political will to make changes, and change will happen, whether it be negative or positive. And so empowering local communities by offering, again, green jobs to make sure it's sustainable, by making sure that they're engaged in the process and understand why it's so important, is a great reason to why you might want to address or think about JEDI in the implementation phase. In the analyze phase here, not to the surprise of many people, analyze, adapt, and share doesn't tend to get as much funding. And that's not just a JEDI issue, that's just a conservation problem, I think, across the board. But I think it's just as critical to make sure that we are setting aside funding for the analyze, adapt, and share phase, even though they haven't gotten much love in the past, unfortunately. So for the analyze phase, speak with your leadership to ensure that adequate funding for JEDI is happening. I just kind of spoke to that just now. You also may want to consider hiring a social scientist or environmental economist or anthropologist in this stage, just to make sure you have the ability to truly mine the data appropriately and analyze the data appropriately. Disaggregate your data. So this is a problem that we run into a lot, where we find that someone may do a social study and say, oh, well, in this community, most people are favorable towards conservation, right? But then you disaggregate your data, like, okay, let's do that by race, let's do that by LGBTQ, let's do that by gender, and you find out, oh, actually, even though they are in the minority, every woman hates this project, right? But that didn't come out in the data because we didn't disaggregate it. We just lumped everyone all together as one big group. And when you do that, you lose out on the ability to be equitable in engaging diverse communities because you've lumped them all together into one data set. So disaggregating your data and really looking at the various identity groups and how they feel about each of the project is much different than when you lump all together into one community. This is a good time to also conduct an internal assessment. This is a good time to check in and say, well, how have we been doing? Have any issues come up? Are we adequately trained in JEDI principles to be effective in this space? Do we have the right partners? Who did we miss in this process? Maybe you weren't aware of a marginalized group in the beginning, but now that you've done some analysis, you're like, okay, actually we can point out at least 3 additional marginalized groups that we hadn't thought about before that may be more integral to this project than we thought about initially. And then also from your analysis, you may want to consider requesting an extension from your donor. This is a good opportunity to have good relationships. This is why it's important to have good relationship with your funders overall, especially when you're working on any social issue, but especially JEDI issues. There may be a need to request an extension because you're learning throughout this process that we need to build more trust, or we didn't engage the right individuals in the beginning. And so we may need to extend our time and also potentially our funding. In the adapt phase, this is analyze and adapt, but I just separated them out. In the adapt phase, look for areas that may have been misunderstood in the assess phase. So again, you're only going to know but so much when you do your assessment. This is a good time in the adapt phase to go back to that assessment and say, what did we miss? Who did we overlook? And again, much of what I kind of said on the last slide. Review all documented feedback from marginalized communities. So again, you may be getting feedback and you may not have had the opportunity to really engage with that feedback fully. If you haven't, this is the time to go back and say, okay, let's dedicate time in the adapt phase. Let's see how we're doing. Let's see how maybe our level of trust is with these communities. Let's make sure that whoever we've hired locally is an effective person, right? Maybe we didn't let that person go and hire someone different. Tough decisions to make, but it's important to make those so that you're not just saying, well, we hired them, so we'll have to make it work. No, you can let them go and look at maybe there's another or better representative in that group who can do the job for you. Or maybe the person you hired has been doing stellar work, and now you're at a phase of work where they just can't match up. Their skill sets don't match up to the need. And so you may need to hire a different type of person locally in order to match the needs of the project at that time. I think that's exactly what I said there. So perhaps there's a need to engage with new individuals to truly ensure equitable conservation. So again, this is the important phase where you should be able to pivot if necessary, be flexible is what the conservation standards are all about, and see if there's a need to go back to the assess or implement phase. And then lastly is the share phase. And so what we're hearing from organizations is that, well, there's a couple of things. So first, we need to ensure that systemically oppressed groups have a chance to evaluate all final documents. And what's important here is that they need to be able to digest it in their local languages. So of course, translation is a huge piece of this, but we also, what we tend to do, what we have seen is that these conservation groups send out the report, but then they just keep on with their project. They actually don't have any intention of taking feedback from the communities. It was more of a checkbox, like, oh, we sent it back out to them. But these groups may need time to digest what you're saying. They actually may need you to do a presentation for them, because a report with a bunch of jargon is not going to be useful to a local community whose education level may not be past 5th or 6th grade or even high school level. They're not going to be able to just take this report and say, oh, I understand everything they're saying here. They may need you to do a some sort of webinar or presentation with them to truly break down what's being said and give them the chance to ask questions. In the share phase, again, it's important to start connecting with other environmental organizations. Well, I say it towards the end, but I'll say it here. It's important for us to share out this information around JEDI. What I've learned from the interview process is that a lot of sharing is not happening around JEDI specifically because there's a lot of failure that comes with this process, and people are afraid of sharing failure. And so what instead happens, because folks are afraid of sharing failure, is that instead they begin, all conservation groups are doing the exact same mistake over and over and over and over again, because no one's sharing with each other about the mistakes that have been made in the past. And so it's critically important that we are connecting with other environmental organizations and that we create a culture of failure that is okay, so that we can share that information. Because if we're keeping it internally, all we're doing is harming more communities, because we're not taking the chance to avoid those pitfalls. So don't look at it as, I don't want to share my failure. Look at it as, I'm trying to reduce conflict and pain and trauma on other communities that may happen because there's no information out there about how to do this correctly. Also consider presenting at non-conservation conferences. So if your project has a health component, a youth component, an LGBTQ component, maybe consider going to conferences that are focused on those social topics. They need to hear conservation voices in those spaces so that they can begin to understand and connect why those social issues are important to conservation, to nature, and to the ecology. So I think we need to increase our voices in social settings and social identity concerns, so that we can begin to show up in spaces that we're not commonly showing up. And then, of course, making sure to share with funders about the challenges and successes of doing JEDI work. It's important to do this because funders are going to continue funding projects with the knowledge they have available, which is that I hear no complaints. Conservation groups aren't upset by how much money and time I'm giving them, so let's just continue doing it this way. Instead, conservation groups, we do need to step up and start being more vocal about the fact that we need more time and money because of the social component, and just being able to lay out for them, this is how much additional cost it would take if I were to do this project again. Again, we try to highlight the best parts of a project and we leave out some of the failures or the challenges. And I think that hurts us in the conservation field altogether, but especially around tackling JEDI and conservation planning. So just some summary of some common challenges that have occurred. Internal shifts make it very difficult to tackle JEDI. So it's that whole, the new shiny thing. Whenever unless leadership is committed to this, the internal shifts won't allow for conservation groups to focus on JEDI as a core principle and a core part of how they do conservation if they're constantly shifting to the next strategic plan, right? And so we need to find a way to integrate JEDI into the fabric of how we do conservation. Next up is a lot of these reports around JEDI are not being published. And so a lot of conservation groups are working on JEDI, but there's no case studies, there's no projects, there's no published papers. Again, I think it's around that concern about being reflected badly upon. So reports are not being published, unfortunately. So the three groups that are being looked at most commonly are gender, indigenous, and socioeconomic class. For some reason, conservation has boxed themselves into those three identity groups. So again, gender, socioeconomic class, and indigenous peoples. Like for some reason, we have a desire to work with those groups. But what we're overlooking is race, ability, LGBTQ, and other identity groups who are continue to be marginalized because we don't, for some reason, focus on these particular topics. And so just something to kind of be aware of, that there is a pattern of working with those other three identity groups, but we don't work with a more diverse. So I think it's important for us to open up and diversify what we mean when we say marginalized communities and not just stick to gender and primarily cisgender women, socioeconomic class, and indigenous people. It doesn't mean that we stop doing that. It just means we can do better. There is a lack of capacity and ability for folks to do this work because it's not a requirement for how we do conservation. And because it's not coming down from leadership, there's a lack of power and the ability to do this work effectively. We find that strategies are being abandoned. Like we want to start doing JEDI, great, assess phase, we start it. By implementation, we say, oh, it's too hard, let's just not do it. We can still get the conservation project done even without working on JEDI. So strategies, unfortunately, are being abandoned because they're not prioritized, they're not part of how they do the work, and because leadership hasn't made it a priority. And then also, some of the challenges for doing JEDI work is that we're not creating both tangible and intangible benchmarks. We create tangible, but we're really bad at the intangible. And so, for instance, when we talk about, let's get together a diverse group of decision makers, right? Sure, we've made the group 50-50 women and men, and maybe quarter also including non-binary. And so, but what we didn't capture because we didn't have intangible benchmarks are those people who are not men feel safe to speak up in this room? That's an intangible benchmark. And so talking to folks about their safety and their willingness to speak up are also important, not just the number of people and the number of diverse individuals in the room. So as far as what's next here, the intention will be to, really get this report out far and wide, make sure people are reading and kind of going through it. I gave you a big overview. There's a lot more detail in the report. So we need to get these in the hands of practitioners so they can consider what that means for them, increase the marketing of this document like we're doing right now through this particular webinar, and then just seeking more speaking opportunities to engage a wider audiences. So those are some of the main things that we're trying to accomplish right now and pushing forward. And with the help of FOS, and the Conservation Measures Partnership, we are doing our best to get this out to as many people as possible. And Terry's already putting my contact information, I know, into the chat, but if you need to email me directly, it's leander@lacyconsultingservices.com. So let me stop sharing for just a second, and I'm just going to quickly talk about this other next part, and I'll leave the rest of the time for questions. So I'll be as fast as possible. So Bat Conservation International reached out to me after I did this project and saw the report and said, Leander, we've adopted the conservation standards, and that's a core part of how we do our work. We would love for you to help us go through the entire process of how to incorporate JEDI and really transform our conservation programming. And so working with them, we just wrapped up a series of workshops. I'm writing up, like literally today and tomorrow, the case study of how we went through each of the 5 steps in a planning phase. Like we didn't actually go through each of the steps. So I'll explain what we did. So I did a series of workshops with them on A, what I just presented to you, and then B, we actually walked through each of the steps with 2 of their projects. One project is a bat conservation project in Mexico. Another is their community engagement program. And both of the groups we developed what's called guiding questions. And so each of the phases, based on what we've learned, we develop a set of guiding questions that Conservation International will answer as they go through each of the 5 steps on top of their normal ecological assessment they would do. They would also answer these additional questions. And what they found is that these questions have set them apart and set them on a journey of saying, we now know how to be better at incorporating Jedi just because we're answering these questions. Questions that we've never thought about before, that we never would have even considered. But now that we have them written down, we have a process that we can go through now that will ensure that we will be more equitable in our conservation approach just by answering these questions. And so when I took them through that journey, I actually had them use a thing called Easy Retro that I utilize. And what it does is it allows them to, in live time, think about various questions that they want to ask and for each of the stages of each of the steps of the conservation standards. And then you upvote, so you can vote on the ones that you think are the most important to you. So in each of the phases, they actually came up with like 20 to 30 questions, right? And so obviously that's overwhelming. Like no practitioner is going to want to answer 20 to 30 questions. And so what we did is we narrowed it down to their voted top 5, because my approach to this process is I want you to do the questions that you're most excited about because you're more likely to do it, right? Even if there's another question that may be quote unquote better or have more impact, I don't care about that right now. I care about what questions are you actually going to want to answer. And so we focus on those top questions. And so we went through each of the steps, and we basically did a preliminary answering of the questions in preparation for their actual planning phase. And so now that we're done with that, they will be going back to their drawing boards, starting the conservation standards process from the very beginning, and then looking to bring me in at some point for figuring out how to bring a consultant in to address these questions effectively. But it was such a great process. And throughout the entire conversation, I remember my favorite comments, and I'll open up for questions, was, Leander, this is actually really easy now that we see these questions. Like, why was this so hard? And I was like, well, listen, the system was built for you not to address these questions, right? The system, the way that we do conservation was not built in a way to address Jedi concerns. Yes, it's easy, but it wasn't the way that we were taught how to do conservation. And so it's difficult because we're in a system that doesn't allow us to really think about and address these questions effectively. So it was nice to be able to hear that these issues are not overwhelming. It can be addressed, it can be done. It's just a matter of understanding that what system are we in right now that's limiting our ability to think effectively and think through this process. So I know there's a lot of information. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to stop here. And I would love to hear any questions or thoughts or comments.
Great, thank you, Leander. We've got a small enough group. I think if you have a question, raise your hand or just come off mute. John?
Or both.
And thanks very much, Leander. This was really helpful. I actually want to reference a comment that Rob Sutter put in the chat related to using diagrams, results chains, basically change diagrams. And so, because that's really practical advice for how to distinguish your realistic social goals and put them in the right context. So I'm just wondering to what extent the report references those results change diagrams, and with maybe a suggestion that maybe your presentation could also reference those diagrams, make it more practical for people.
Yeah, I love that, John. So here's what I would say based on what I can understand this process right now. I think the visual piece would be fantastic. I think it hasn't been done. Or at least no one's given me any visuals to go by, right? So Bat Conservation International is going to be a great case study because they're going to have a ton of those visuals. We're going to have actual results chains and theories of change and things that we can actually point to and look at. I think most folks had not actually incorporated it into their results chains and theories of change. And if there are examples that anyone knows of, I would love to see them so that we can begin to add those in. I mean, I know they've been done because I know that folks have been working on things like girls education and the importance of that and how it impacts conservation. So I know they exist, but I just don't have access to those.
Okay, yeah, they definitely exist, and I'll send you some hints.
That'll be great. Thank you, John.
Other questions or comments?
Hey, Doug. Yeah.
Just kind of following up. First of all, thanks, Leander. That was really interesting. Got me thinking about a lot of things. Just following up on John's question with respect to illustrating interested parties in a results chain or conceptual diagram, and how they are influenced by or affected by or have influence over a system or situation. That's, if there are examples of that, I'd really be interested in seeing that and have some ideas moving forward on a project here. And I'd just like to see if others have done it. Would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that too. And even John, even some of the examples that you said, I think I'm not going to be critical of it, but I would like to see like who was involved in that process of developing the results change, right? We're local communities, we're diverse individuals in the room when those were created, or were they created just with the minds of those in that conservation organization and no other input, or at least not much other input?
Yeah, that's a whole different question.
Yeah, that's a whole different question. Christina, Doug, did I get to, you were just kind of more giving a comment, right? And kind of just kind of asking out loud.
I'm interested in, yeah, what's been done. Just like, so John, if you could have examples, I'd be grateful if you could share them.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be interested in that. That'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
John, if there are some that you'd be willing to share, when if I could attach them or attach a link to them when I send out the recording, we could do that so that those who are interested in this could have access to them. That would be wonderful. Christina, and then Doug, I don't know if you have a second question, but your hand's still raised. So go ahead, Christina, or did we lose her?
No, I'm here.
You shifted.
Thanks, Leander, for sharing this. And I've just been thinking, you mentioned that intentions, that we should be very clear about what is our motivation or our intention for addressing these really important aspects in our planning process and in the whole adaptive management process. And one thing that we have seen quite a bit in Latin America is that I think we need to be careful not to label others, not to place labels on others. For example, we were working with fishing communities in the Gulf of California, and people were saying, oh, we need to get out more stories that are, that share hope and that don't put them in the, don't portray them as victims or the underdogs of the current situation. And we checked with them and they said, yes, we don't see ourselves as that, but that's how the news portray us. We are always the poor ones. We're the, we are the ones in the situation that, always get the bad end of things. And they said, we don't see ourselves like that. So please stop putting those labels on us. And that for me was really an eye opener, because I think sometimes when with good intentions, we say, oh, let's include all these different groups, interest groups. But we make up what is, we think we understand what their interests are. And there, I think we can go on a slippery slope rather fast. And so I think if we're very honest about our intentions, that can be a good reference point. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Leander. And I guess we're all learning, It's like Doug was asking me at some point, should we include people who are no longer even present in a territory, but they're, they had to move and now they're, I don't have the answer to that. I guess, the project team needs to think about that. And if it makes sense, give it a try, but consider the consequences of time and money and everything else. That's, can you do it well enough?
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for mentioning the intention. I think that can be a good anchor to keep us honest.
Joshua.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was
Respond
just gonna,
first. Sorry.
yeah, a quick follow up, and then you have Joshua for sure. I think it's really important. That's why we say so often, and especially in the assess phase, to actually talk with those marginalized communities and don't make assumptions. It's making assumptions is going to hurt us more than anything else as we go into this process. And we are all going to come in. We all have biases. Is programmed into how we live our life. We all are receiving messages every single day about different identity groups, and we're going to come in with those biases every single time, right? And so your expectation or understanding about Black community may be based on what movies you've seen, what the news has said, all those other things that have shaped your reality around what that group is, until you've actually talked to that group and realized, oh, that's just media. That's just a one-time incident. That is just a sensationalized way of thinking about that identity group, but that's not actually the way that identity group lives on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, Joshua?
Yeah, no, that's really hitting the nail on the head. I think it's pretty much echoing Christina and others. I think we know this as a fairly in tune, sensitive group, but I know I harbor fear sometimes of engaging, not knowing that I'll be able to sustain the level of relationship that I think is needed to be clear and present and trusted. I may be able to gain trust, but can I really? I guess it cautions us to be careful moving in to say what our limitations are, and anyone may change jobs or lose their budget or something like that. But so maybe that's it. Maybe just prefacing our engagement with the knowledge that we're going to do the best we can. These are our intentions, but we need to go in honestly to say this may not work out, but we really hope it does, and really want to provide you, the local person, with the most to gain with our the best we can do in terms of helping. Obviously trying to come in as, oh, we're your saviors, we're going to teach you. It's such a tricky dance. So I appreciate this learning, and I put my little message in from a recent meeting with the Passamaquoddies that was really one of those, a friendly slap in the face, but a needed slap in the face. Like, don't call us stakeholders, buddy. It's just like, yeah, okay, you're right. We throw this term around pretty loosely. So any reflections you have in terms of how to engage with earnest honesty, wanting to be inclusive and yet not feeling like, one, that we're making promises we can't keep for duration that we maybe can't keep, and two, that we're being, we're not coming in as somebody else's savior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that kind of gives in the savior issue, as well as tokenism issue comes up as well. And the best way to smash through all of that is to be transparent. Tokenism and those and savior complexes can't happen unless transparency does not exist. Because when there's transparency and there's, here's how much money we're putting towards this, here is our budget, here is our whole plan, here's what we intend to do. And if something does fall through, if something doesn't happen, like funding got pulled, well, now you can see why we can't do this. You saw our budget, you saw what we were intending to do. Unfortunately, this money got pulled. Maybe. Yeah, so having those really frank and honest conversations really smashes through those type of topics. And I would say, again, there is intentionality around building trust. And so, as I mentioned before, there are so many social science studies out there about the topic of trust and the different types of trust that exist, that we tend to, as a society, we like, trust is an easy topic. We all know it. But there's actually a lot more underneath it that if you really want to dig into it. So I've done a lot of workshops with conservation organizations on how to build and sustain trust, utilizing the social science of trust. And so there's actually great approaches for how to do this in a more systematic and intentional way, in a more strategic way than what we tend to do, which is say, we know we need to build it, but we don't have any strategies to how we're going to accomplish that. And so talking through those strategies and being transparent with those strategies is another way to build trust and have transparency with local communities.
Great. I have a follow-on from what Joshua was saying. So stakeholders is a loaded word with some communities. Is the same, could the same be said with marginalized or underserved?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a term that resonates better with many people. I find this with race too. I was told, do not use Hispanic, and I'm like, okay, what should I use? Well, you need to ask them what they are, and I'm like, okay, that works, but when you haven't met them yet, what do what do you say? Is there, what are those terms that won't, or might work better?
Yeah, there's no good answer to that. It really is about engaging and being willing to step in it and put your foot in your mouth and be okay. There's nothing wrong about making mistakes, right? And, if you misgender someone, you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean, like, can you tell me what your gender is, right? That's just all it is. It's really about caring enough about people to want to be respectful. And so knowing that you're going to mess up and messing up is okay. It doesn't mean that you go around and say, well, I don't have to learn anything because I'm just going to apologize for whatever I do. You have to put some work in and say, okay, I'm not going to use Hispanic. I'm going to use Latino, or I'm going to call them by their country of origin. And some people don't like Latinx, right? Like Latinx doesn't work for them. Like, don't call me Latinx. I'm Latino or I'm Latina. And that's okay. All you're doing is saying, I understand and I appreciate you gifting me with information, and I'll do my best in the future. And that may really be about a one-on-one and not about the whole community.
Great. Well, I see our time is up. Great discussion, great questions and such afterwards, and wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Leander. And I'll capture, John provided some more information, and we'll send out the information to the North America folks.
I'm going to add one last thing, if you don't mind, Terry, is that in 2 weeks, a podcast will be coming out actually with Christina Lash. I do a podcast called the Green Mind Podcast, and we'll be talking about Jedi topics in CCNet. So I would love for anyone to, who doesn't already listen to podcasts, feel free to listen to the Green Mind Podcast. And in 2 weeks, you'll hear a conversation with me and Christina.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.